The city was alive with light, yet beneath its glittering skyline lay shadows most people chose not to see. In glass towers that pierced the clouds, men and women spoke of profits and power, sipping wine that cost more than a laborer's monthly wage. And in alleys just beyond their sight, the forgotten clutched scraps of bread, praying for a tomorrow that would look kinder than today. Thomas Mitchell often wondered which world he truly belonged to. Billionaire, philanthropist, visionary, titles the media attached to his name like badges of honor. Yet behind the carefully polished image, Thomas wrestled with doubts few would imagine haunted a man of his stature. He had wealth beyond measure, yet he was never certain if those around him respected him or simply bowed to his fortune. His late father's words echoed in his mind as they had for years. One day, Thomas, you'll see that money can buy loyalty, but never integrity. If you truly want to know a person's heart, test them when temptation is near. Tonight, Thomas decided to honor that lesson. Inside the marble-floored lobby of his skyscraper, under the cold glow of security lights, he left a briefcase. Leather, polished, unremarkable at a glance, except for what rested inside. Neat stacks of bills, $20,000 in all, crisp enough to tempt even the most disciplined hand. Then he waited. From an upper balcony hidden in shadow, Thomas watched as employees passed through the lobby after a long day. Suits and silk dresses, secretaries carrying handbags, executives speaking into their phones. Each one noticed the briefcase, yet not one touched it. Some quickened their pace, some pretended it wasn't there. Until she appeared, Diana Alvarez, a cleaning woman in her mid-30s, walked slowly, her back aching from hours of labor. In one hand, she held a cloth bag of supplies. In the other, the tiny hand of her daughter, Jasmine. The girl was no more than 6. Bright-eyed, lively, untouched by the cynicism adults carried like scars. She spotted the briefcase first and slipped free of her mother's grasp with innocent curiosity. Kneeling beside it, she tugged open the zipper and gasped at the sight inside. "Mommy, look!" she said in awe, holding up a bill bigger than her small hand. Diana froze. Her heart pounded as her eyes darted across the empty lobby, expecting someone to accuse them, to descend on them with suspicion. She rushed forward, gently but firmly taking the money from Jasmine's hand. "No, mi amor," she whispered, forcing calm into her voice. "This isn't ours. Money like this, it can bring trouble. We must give it back." Jasmine's lips curved in a tiny frown. "But no one's here. Maybe it's a gift?" Diana closed the briefcase with trembling fingers and lifted it with both hands. "A gift like this doesn't belong to us," she said firmly. Then, with her daughter beside her, she carried it to the security desk. "Someone left this behind," she told the guard, placing it on the counter. "Please make sure it's returned." The guard blinked, stunned. "You're giving this back?" Diana simply nodded, though fear still sat heavy in her chest. From his hidden place, Thomas exhaled softly, his lips curving in the faintest smile. Integrity had spoken in the most unlikely voice, not from the wealthy, not from the powerful, but from a mother teaching her child the difference between right and wrong. The next morning, the skyscraper's boardroom gleamed with polished oak and glass. Power gathered around its long table in the form of men in tailored suits and women with eyes sharp as blades. At the head sat Thomas, his expression calm but unreadable. Among the board members was Richard Blackwood, a man whose name carried weight in business circles and whispers of scandal in quieter corners. Tall, handsome, his smile polished for charm but edged with arrogance, Richard represented everything Thomas distrusted. "This company," Richard declared, leaning back in his chair, "cannot thrive on sentiment. We must seize every opportunity, every deal, every advantage, no matter the cost. That is how empires are built." A few nodded in agreement. Others shifted uneasily. Thomas rose, his presence commanding the room without effort. With him, he carried the briefcase. He set it on the table and opened it, revealing the stacks of bills. Gasps filled the air. "This," Thomas said, his voice measured, "was left in our lobby last night. $20,000. Anyone could have taken it. None of you did. But it was not an executive, not a manager, not a shareholder who returned it. It was a cleaning woman and her little girl." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard scoffed. "So what?" "She did what anyone would do. Why glorify someone for not stealing? Thomas's gaze sharpened. No, Richard, not everyone would. In fact, very few would. Integrity is not the absence of opportunity. It is the strength to resist when no one is watching. The words settled over the boardroom like a stone dropped in still water. Some lowered their eyes, uncomfortable. Others looked at Richard, whose smirk faltered, if only for a moment. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. Richard's ambition burned too brightly, his hunger too sharp. If left unchecked, it could consume the company Thomas had spent a lifetime building. And so quietly, Thomas prepared his second test, one that would reveal not just honesty, but loyalty, greed, and the true price of a man's soul. That night, Thomas sat alone in his penthouse. The city spread beneath him like a field of glittering stars. He had built an empire out of glass and steel, yet it was the face of a cleaning woman and her daughter that haunted him more than all the numbers on his spreadsheets. Diana Alvarez. He had read her file after she returned the briefcase. Migrant, widowed mother of one. Worked nights to pay rent. Mornings to care for her daughter. Afternoons to catch whatever hours of sleep she could before returning to scrub the marble floors of men like Richard Blackwood. Thomas found himself wondering, how long could a person like her carry such weight without breaking? And how many in his gleaming towers walked past her each night, never seeing her, never realizing the strength it took simply to endure? The city outside his window whispered back with no answers. By morning, Thomas had made a decision. When Diana arrived at work, still weary from another sleepless night, she was summoned not to the janitorial closet, but to the executive floor. Nervous, she clutched Jasmine's hand as they were led into an office larger than her entire apartment. There, Thomas Mitchell waited. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said, standing as they entered. His voice was warm, not the cold tone she expected from a billionaire. "Please sit." Diana hesitated. "Sir, if this is about the briefcase, we didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't cause trouble," Thomas interrupted gently. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "You showed me something I had almost forgotten, integrity. And for that, I owe you more than thanks." He reached into a drawer and slid an envelope across the polished wood. Inside was a check that made Diana's eyes widen, her breath catch. I can't take this," she stammered. "You can," Thomas said firmly. "And you will. It is not charity. It is recognition." Jasmine, curious, peeked over the desk with bright eyes. "Are you the man who left the suitcase?" Thomas chuckled softly. "Something like that, little one." The moment was warm, almost tender. Yet even as Diana's gratitude shone in her trembling smile, Thomas's thoughts returned to Richard Blackwood. Because if Diana had revealed the quiet strength of the powerless, Richard was revealing the corruption of the powerful. In the weeks that followed, rumors began to stir. Deals approved without transparency. Contracts awarded to companies suspiciously linked to Richard's associates. Small discrepancies in accounts that grew, like cracks in marble, into something more dangerous. Thomas watched. He listened. And then he set the second test. At a board meeting cloaked in formality, he announced a new project, a charitable foundation, designed to funnel profits into rebuilding struggling neighborhoods. Outwardly, it was a noble cause. In truth, it was bait. "We will need someone to oversee operations," Thomas said, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Richard. "I believe you are best positioned for the task." Richard's smile was immediate, though his eyes betrayed something sharper, hunger. The foundation was granted full autonomy over millions of dollars in funds. Richard took the role with practiced humility, thanking Thomas for his trust. But Thomas knew the truth. He had just placed temptation in the hands of a man, already teetering on the edge. And as the months passed, the edge crumbled. Money disappeared in subtle increments. Construction projects billed for materials never delivered. Contractors paid for work that never began. Richard grew bolder, convinced no one was watching. But Thomas was watching. One late evening, after the boardroom lights had dimmed and the skyscraper's corridors lay empty, Thomas confronted Richard. "You've been busy," Thomas said, his tone calm, almost conversational. As Richard looked up from his desk, Richard smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Building your vision, Thomas. Isn't that what you wanted? Is that what you call it?" Thomas asked quietly. He set a folder on the desk, Inside, copies of forged invoices, hidden accounts, damning evidence. I gave you trust, Richard. You turned it into theft. For a moment, Richard's mask cracked. Then he laughed, low and cold. Do you think anyone will believe you? The board follows me now. They're tired of your sermons about morality. They want results, profits, power, and I deliver. Thomas studied him, the way one might study a fire spreading across dry wood. And what happens when the fire consumes you too? Richard leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Then at least I'll burn brighter than you ever dared. The words lingered in the silence that followed. Thomas left that night knowing a storm was coming. One man's greed was about to test not just the integrity of a company, but the soul of a city built on illusions of grandeur. And when the storm broke, everyone, from billionaires in penthouses to mothers, scrubbing marble floors, would be forced to choose where they stood. The storm began quietly, almost invisibly, a whisper here, a headline there. At first it was dismissed as noise, the kind of baseless chatter that drifts through corporate corridors but never lingers. Yet beneath the surface, something darker brewed. An investigative journalist, eager for a breakthrough, stumbled upon irregularities in the charitable foundation's financial records, a missing trail of invoices, shell companies tied to Richard's name, payments disguised as community outreach but funneled elsewhere. One article became two became 10. Soon, the city's most respected papers carried headlines that shook the skyscraper kingdom to its core. Embezzlement allegations surface in Blackwood Foundation. Millions missing from projects promised to the poor. Betrayal behind the glass towers? Richard, ever the showman, went on the offensive. He dismissed the reports as smear campaigns. He appeared on television, polished and smiling, speaking of philanthropy, hope, and the dangers of fake news. For a time, many believed him. But truth, once given oxygen, has a way of burning through lies. Thomas did not step forward immediately. He watched. He measured the moment, like a chess player waiting for his opponent to overreach. And overreach Richard did. One evening, Diana came home to find Jasmine at the kitchen table, carefully folding a flyer she had been given at school. It bore the Blackwood Foundation's logo, promising a new community center coming soon. Jasmine's eyes sparkled with hope. Mom, maybe this time it's real, she said softly. Maybe things can change. Diana bit her lip, holding back the truth. She knew better. She had seen enough of the world to recognize when promises were illusions. And yet, as she tucked Jasmine into bed that night, she prayed, not for buildings of brick and glass, but for justice however it might come. Justice came sooner than she expected. It began with a board meeting that should have been routine. Richard walked in, confident as ever, only to find Thomas waiting with auditors, lawyers, and a mountain of evidence. The room fell silent as the documents were laid out. Fake signatures, ghost employees, transfers to offshore accounts. Every page stripped away Richard's armor until the only thing left was his fury. You think this will destroy me? Richard hissed, rising to his feet. I am this company. Without me, it collapses. Without me, you're nothing but an old man clinging to fairy tales. No, Thomas replied calmly. Without integrity, we are all nothing. You've mistaken wealth for power, Richard. But true power lies in trust, and you've burned every last shred of it. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Some members shouted for Richard's resignation, others tried to defend him. Cameras from the press, invited quietly by Thomas, flashed as the confrontation spilled into headlines by morning. By nightfall, Richard Blackwood was no longer a trusted executive. He was the face of scandal. But scandal has a way of reaching beyond its origin. As lawsuits mounted and investigators dug deeper, the entire empire trembled. Stocks fell, investors fled, politicians who once shook. Richard's hand now distanced themselves with cold statements. In the chaos, Diana found herself once again standing at the edge of forces, far larger than she could control. She received a letter from the foundation, payment for work she had never done, signed in her name. Richard had used her identity to cover his theft. Terrified, she took the letter to Thomas. He read it, his face hardening. He dragged you into this, Thomas murmured. That was his final mistake. Diana's hands trembled. What if they think I was involved? They won't, Thomas said firmly. Not while I have a voice. For the first time since her husband's death, Diana allowed herself to believe she was not alone. As the city held its breath, awaiting the downfall of a titan, whispers spread in every direction. Some said Richard would flee. Others swore he would strike back, using secrets gathered over decades to blackmail his enemies. Thomas knew one thing: Richard would not go quietly. Men like him never did, and he was right. On a rain-soaked evening, as thunder rolled across the skyline, Richard appeared at Thomas's penthouse uninvited. His suit was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, but his arrogance remained intact. "You think you've beaten me," he said, pouring himself a drink without asking. "But I've built something you can't destroy: fear. It lingers longer than trust. When the dust settles, people will remember that I was willing to do whatever it took." Thomas studied him, the storm outside reflected in his eyes. "And when the dust settles, they'll also remember the man who tore down his own house to prove he could." Richard's laugh was hollow, broken. "We'll see." He left without another word, the door slamming like a gunshot. It was the last time Thomas Mitchell ever saw him. Because days later, Richard Blackwood disappeared. Some claimed he fled the country, his fortune hidden in offshore accounts. Others whispered of darker endings, debts unpaid, enemies silencing him for good. No body was ever found, no truth ever confirmed. But for Diana, for Jasmine, and for the countless others touched by the scandal, his absence was enough. And as the city began to rebuild, not just its structures, but its conscience, one truth lingered like a flame that refused to die. Integrity, once lit, could outshine even the darkest towers of glass. In the weeks that followed Richard's disappearance, the city lived in a strange tension, as though holding its breath, waiting for him to reappear like a ghost at the window. Every rumor carried weight. A blurry photo of a man boarding a private jet in South America. A bank account in Switzerland suddenly emptied. A yacht spotted drifting near the Mediterranean. But none of these whispers brought closure. They only deepened the mystery, feeding the legend of Richard Blackwood, the man who built an empire of glass and lies, then vanished into the shadows. For Diana, however, life had to move forward. Bills still needed paying. Jasmine still needed school lunches packed. The world did not stop spinning simply because one powerful man had fallen. Yet something inside her had shifted. Where once she had felt like a pawn in someone else's game, now she stood taller, surer. One morning, as she walked Jasmine to school, she noticed neighbors who had once looked past her now nodding in quiet respect. She hadn't asked for their admiration, but she carried it with grace. It was not the respect of wealth or status, but of survival, of dignity held under fire. Thomas, meanwhile, became an unlikely symbol himself. Interviews, articles, and talk shows praised him as the man who dared to confront corruption within his own house. Yet he remained cautious, almost somber, aware that victory had come at a terrible price. One evening, as the city's skyline burned orange with the setting sun, Thomas visited Diana's modest apartment. Jasmine greeted him with a hug, her innocence untouched by the storm that had passed. Diana poured tea, her hands steady for the first time in months. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. "I did," Thomas replied, settling into a chair. "Because this isn't finished. The foundation still holds weight. Projects still hang in balance. If we don't rebuild, others will step in, and not all of them will have good intentions." Diana studied him. There was weariness in his eyes, but also something else: resolve. A fire that had not burned out despite the years. "You want me involved?" she said, almost as a statement. Thomas smiled faintly. "You've seen the cracks up close. You know what suffering looks like. If the foundation is to mean anything again, it needs voices like yours." The idea terrified her. She was no politician, no executive. She was a mother trying to hold her life together. And yet, as Jasmine played in the corner, Diana felt a strange certainty settle over her. Perhaps this was not a burden but an opportunity. "All right," she said at last, her voice firm. "But if I do this, it has to be real. No lies, no empty promises." The people we claim to serve deserve more than that. Thomas nodded. That's exactly why I came to you. Thus began a quiet rebirth. The Blackwood Foundation, once a symbol of corruption, slowly reshaped itself into something new. Programs that had been abandoned were revived. Community centers opened their doors. Scholarships were granted without bias. And for the first time, people began to believe that change was not only possible but real. Diana, though reluctant at first, became a cornerstone of this transformation. She spoke not from polished scripts, but from lived experience, of hardship, of perseverance, of hope wrestled from despair. Her words carried weight precisely because they were unvarnished. Jasmine watched with wide eyes as her mother stood at podiums and in meeting halls, speaking truths that others had been too afraid to voice. For the little girl who once dreamed only of a father's return, a new dream blossomed, a belief that even ordinary people could reshape the world. And yet beneath this renewal, shadows lingered. Richard's absence was never far from anyone's mind. Some feared his return. Others longed for it, convinced only he could restore the empire to its former glory. And then there were those who whispered of unfinished debts, of enemies who might one day come knocking on Diana's door, demanding payment for Richard's sins. One night, as rain pattered softly against her window, Diana lay awake, unable to sleep. A thought crept into her mind, not of fear, but of reckoning. She realized that Richard's downfall was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a larger struggle, one that would test not only her but the entire city. For corruption, like weeds, never truly dies. It waits, it grows in silence, and when least expected, it returns. Diana turned to look at Jasmine, asleep beside her, peaceful in dreams untouched by shadows. She whispered a silent vow into the darkness. Whatever comes, I will not run. I will not bend. This time we stand tall. Months slipped into a year. Seasons changed, painting the city in shifting colors. The pale blush of spring blossoms, the heavy gold of summer, the rust of autumn leaves, and finally the quiet gray of winter snow. Through it all, the Blackwood Foundation endured. But endurance was not the same as peace. For every school repaired, there was another politician who whispered doubts. For every family lifted, there was another corporation plotting its own schemes in the shadows. Diana learned quickly that change was not a single battle, but a war of attrition, a war fought not with grand speeches alone, but with persistence, patience, and unshakable integrity. At times she faltered. There were nights when exhaustion weighed on her like chains, when she questioned whether she was strong enough to keep walking this new path. But in those moments, she would see Jasmine's eyes bright with belief, and remember why she had chosen to stand. Thomas, too, carried his own burdens. Age was beginning to show in his face, lines carved by decades of decisions both righteous and regrettable. Yet his spirit remained unbroken, sharpened by the knowledge that he was not alone anymore. One cold evening, he and Diana walked together through a half-finished community center, the sound of hammers echoing faintly in the distance. "Do you ever regret it?" Diana asked, pulling her coat tighter. "Not turning a blind eye, I mean." "It would have been easier." Thomas paused, studying the scaffolding rising against the night sky. "I regret many things in my life, but not that. Never that. If I had ignored Richard, I would have lost myself." Diana nodded, her breath curling into the air. She understood now what he meant. That silence in the face of corruption was its own kind of theft, the theft of one's own soul. The center would open months later to laughter and music, filled not with marble floors or crystal chandeliers, but with children's voices, art on the walls and books in eager hands. For Diana, standing there on opening day, it felt like the first true victory of her life. Yet even as joy spread through the community, a letter arrived that would unsettle everything. It was addressed to Diana, written in a hand she did not recognize. Inside was a single sentence. "Richard Blackwood is not gone. He is waiting." No signature. No return address, only those words, heavy with menace. For days, Diana tried to push it from her mind. Perhaps it was a cruel joke, a leftover whisper from the past. But deep down, she knew better. Men like Richard did not vanish. They retreated. They plotted. They waited for their moment to strike again. She showed the letter to Thomas one evening. He read it twice, his jaw tightening, then folded it carefully. If he returns, Thomas said slowly, he will find a city changed. A city not so easy to bend. Diana searched his eyes. And if he comes for me? Thomas held her gaze, steady as stone. Then he'll find you are not the woman he remembers. You've grown stronger, Diana, stronger than even he can understand. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the city's distant hum. Then Diana exhaled, a slow breath that carried both fear and resolve. She realized then that the story was not about Richard at all. Not anymore. It was about what rose in the space his downfall created, about the ordinary people who discovered they were extraordinary, when forced to stand against the weight of corruption. It was about a mother who learned her voice could move mountains, a child who grew up believing that courage was not a fairy tale, but a truth lived every day, a weary billionaire who found redemption not in profits but in principles, and a city that, for the first time in decades, began to believe in itself again. The future was uncertain. Shadows still lingered at the edge of the skyline, and perhaps Richard truly was out there, waiting, watching. But whatever storms lay ahead, Diana knew this. She was no longer afraid. Because the story of Richard Blackwood had ended in ruin, but the story of Diana Alvarez, of Jasmine, of Thomas, of countless unseen voices rising together, had only just begun.